Lieutenant Commander Marcus Brennan watched in disbelief as the gull-winged fighter shot past his Hellcat like it was standing still. Below them, a Japanese Zero pilot was about to experience something that would shatter everything he thought he knew about American aircraft. What happened in the skies over the Marshall Islands that morning would leave seasoned Japanese aces questioning their own eyes and forever change how they viewed the dreaded Corsair's climbing ability. What happened in the skies over the Marshall Islands that morning would leave seasoned Japanese aces questioning their own eyes and forever change how they viewed the dreaded Corsair's climbing ability.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of March 15th, 1944 broke clear and humid over Kwajalein Atoll. Lieutenant Jake Morrison adjusted his oxygen mask as he guided his F4U Corsair through the pre-dawn darkness, the distinctive bent wings cutting through air thick with tropical moisture. Morrison was relatively new to VMF 124, having joined the squadron just 6 weeks earlier after completing his training at Cherry Point. At 22, he possessed the typical confidence of a young Marine pilot, but he'd yet to face the legendary Japanese Zero in actual combat. 3,000 feet below, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Nakamura was leading a reconnaissance flight of 4 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros. Nakamura was no rookie, with over 2 years of combat experience and 16 confirmed victories. He'd earned respect throughout the Imperial Navy's fighter units. His Zero, tail number 6112, had been his faithful companion through battles over Guadalcanal, Rabaul, and now the Marshall Islands. The aircraft's lightweight construction and exceptional maneuverability had saved his life countless times, and Nakamura had developed an almost spiritual connection with the machine. The Japanese formation was returning from a failed attempt to locate American shipping lanes when Morrison's division spotted them. Captain Robert Hayes, Morrison's flight leader, immediately called out the contact over the radio. Hayes was a veteran with 12 kills to his name, and his experience showed in the calm, measured way he directed his pilots into an attack position. "Tally 4 bandits, Angels 8, heading 270, Hayes transmitted. "Mako flight, let's take them from above. Morrison, stay tight on my wing." But Morrison's positioning wasn't perfect. As Hayes initiated the dive, Morrison found himself slightly behind and to the right, not quite in the optimal attack position his flight leader had intended. The 4 Zeros had spotted the incoming Corsairs and immediately broke formation, with Nakamura pulling his Zero into a sharp climbing turn to the left. What happened next would become the stuff of legend among both American and Japanese pilots in the Pacific theater. Morrison, realizing he was out of position for the coordinated attack, made a split-second decision that went against everything he'd been taught about energy management. Instead of following Hayes into the dive to maintain speed and altitude, Morrison pulled his Corsair's nose up and began climbing directly after Nakamura's ascending Zero. Nakamura glanced back and couldn't suppress a slight smile. The American pilot was making a fundamental tactical error. Every experienced Zero pilot knew that their aircraft's superior power-to-weight ratio and climb rate gave them a decisive advantage in vertical maneuvering. The Corsair might be faster in level flight and have better high-altitude performance, but in a climbing contest, especially at medium altitudes, the Zero should dominate. The two aircraft began what appeared to be a classic climbing duel. Nakamura's Zero, weighing just over 6,000 pounds when loaded, had always been able to outclimb heavier American fighters. The Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines in the Wildcats and even the more powerful R2800s in some of the newer American fighters had never been able to match the Zero's climbing performance below 15,000 feet. But Morrison's Corsair wasn't just any American fighter. The F4U he was flying represented the culmination of years of aerodynamic refinement and engine development. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 8W Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, nearly double what most Japanese fighters could generate. More importantly, the engine maintained its power output remarkably well at altitude thanks to its advanced two-stage supercharger system. As both aircraft clawed for altitude, Nakamura began to notice something unsettling. The Corsair, which should have been falling behind in the climb, was not only keeping pace, but actually seemed to be gaining ground. At first, Nakamura attributed this to pilot error. Perhaps the American was sacrificing too much airspeed for altitude and would eventually stall or be forced to level off. But Morrison had been well trained in the Corsair's capabilities. He understood that his aircraft's climb rate actually improved with altitude, while most Japanese fighters began to lose climbing performance above 10,000 feet. Morrison maintained his airspeed at exactly 160 knots indicated, the optimal climbing speed for his particular aircraft configuration and weight. Nakamura's confidence began to waver as they passed through 12,000 feet. The American fighter was now clearly gaining on him, and worse yet, the Corsair pilot seemed to be maintaining better energy management throughout the climb. Where Nakamura's Zero was beginning to labour slightly in the thinner air, Morrison's Corsair appeared to be hitting its stride. The psychological impact on Nakamura was profound. For over 2 years, he had relied on the Zero's climbing ability as his primary defensive weapon. When American fighters dived on him, he climbed. When he needed to disengage from unfavorable combat situations, he climbed. The vertical dimension had always been his sanctuary, the one place where Japanese engineering superiority still held sway over American industrial might. At 15,000 feet, the impossible became undeniable. Morrison's Corsair had not only matched Nakamura's Zero in the climb, but was now clearly ahead by several hundred feet. The bent-wing fighter's distinctive silhouette hung above the Zero like a predator stalking its prey, completely inverting the expected dynamic of the engagement. Nakamura's wingman, Petty Officer Kenji Yamamoto, witnessed the entire encounter from 1,000 feet away as he engaged one of the other Corsairs. Years later, Yamamoto would describe the moment as seeing the impossible made real. The sight of a heavy American fighter outclimbing their best Zero pilot shattered assumptions that had guided Japanese fighter tactics since the beginning of the war.
Morrison, for his part, was equally surprised by his aircraft's performance. His training had prepared him for the Corsair's speed and firepower advantages, but the ease with which he'd gained the vertical advantage over a Zero caught him off guard. As he rolled inverted and prepared to dive on the now lower Japanese fighter, Morrison felt a surge of confidence in his aircraft that would stay with him for the rest of his combat tour. The engagement that followed was brief but decisive. With the altitude advantage firmly in hand, Morrison dove on Nakamura's Zero with overwhelming energy superiority. Nakamura, his primary defensive option neutralized, was forced to rely on horizontal maneuvering to evade the attack. But the Corsair's diving speed and powerful armament made escape nearly impossible. 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted in a concentrated burst that lasted just 2 seconds. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds found their mark, striking Nakamura's Zero in the engine compartment and right wing root. The lightweight Japanese fighter, built for agility rather than survivability, couldn't withstand the punishment. Flames began to stream from the engine cowling as hydraulic fluid and fuel mixed in a deadly cocktail. Nakamura had no choice but to bail out, his parachute deploying just as his Zero began its final spiral toward the Pacific waters below. As he descended under the white silk canopy, Nakamura found himself replaying the engagement over and over in his mind, trying to understand how the fundamental assumptions about American fighter performance had proven so dramatically wrong. Within hours of Nakamura's rescue by a Japanese submarine, his account of the engagement reached the headquarters of the 2nd Air Fleet on Truk Atoll. Commander Saburo Watanabe, Chief Intelligence Officer for Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's aviation units, initially dismissed the report as combat stress or possible pilot error. The idea that an American fighter could outclimb a Zero contradicted 2 years of accumulated combat data and fundamental understanding of aircraft parameters. But Nakamura's reputation preceded him. Squadron commanders throughout the Imperial Navy knew him as a methodical, conservative pilot who rarely embellished his combat reports. His previous 16 victory claims had all been verified through multiple sources, and his technical assessments of enemy aircraft had proven consistently accurate. When a pilot of Nakamura's caliber reported something impossible, it demanded serious consideration. Watanabe ordered an immediate review of all recent combat reports involving encounters with the bent-wing American fighters. What emerged from this analysis painted a disturbing picture that extended far beyond a single engagement over the Marshall Islands. Flight Sergeant Toshiro Sato from the Rabaul-based 204th Air Group had filed a report 3 weeks earlier describing a similar experience during a bomber interception mission. Sato's encounter had occurred at dawn on February 22nd, when his Zero intercepted a formation of American dive bombers attacking Japanese shipping in Simpson Harbor. A lone Corsair had appeared from above, diving towards Sato's aircraft in what appeared to be a standard vertical attack. Following established defensive procedures, Sato had pulled his Zero into a maximum performance climb, expecting to gain separation and force the American pilot to overshoot. Instead, the Corsair had matched his climb rate effortlessly, maintaining perfect firing position throughout the ascent. Only a timely intervention by Sato's wingman had prevented his destruction, but the psychological impact lingered. Sato noted in his report that the American fighter seemed to accelerate as it climbed, rather than losing energy as physics and experience suggested it should. Similar reports began surfacing from other operational areas. Lieutenant Kazu Sugino from the 253rd Air Group on Bougainville described an encounter where 3 Zeros had attempted to escape pursuing Corsairs by climbing toward a cloud layer at 18,000 feet. All 3 Japanese fighters had been overtaken and shot down, their traditional escape route transformed into a death trap. The pattern emerging from these reports challenged fundamental assumptions about American aircraft design philosophy. Japanese engineers had always believed that American fighters prioritized speed and firepower over climb rate and maneuverability. The Zero's design represented the opposite philosophy, sacrificing protection and firepower for exceptional agility and climbing ability. Captain Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most respected aviation tacticians, was summoned to Truk to review the accumulated intelligence. Genda had participated in the planning for Pearl Harbor and had personally flown combat missions during the early months of the Pacific War. His understanding of both American and Japanese fighter capabilities was unmatched within the Imperial Navy's aviation establishment. Genda's analysis proved deeply troubling. The Corsair's climbing performance suggested that American engine technology had advanced beyond Japanese intelligence estimates. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine appeared to maintain power output at altitudes where Japanese radial engines began to lose effectiveness. More critically, the Corsair's 2-stage supercharger system seemed to provide sustained power delivery that Japanese single-stage superchargers couldn't match.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The implications extended beyond individual engagements. Japanese fighter tactics had evolved around the Zero's vertical superiority, with standard defensive maneuvers emphasizing climbing turns and high-altitude disengagements. If American fighters could now match or exceed Japanese climb rates, entire tactical doctrines would require fundamental revision. Genda recommended immediate combat trials to verify the reports and develop new tactical responses. The 263rd Air Group, based on WWII Atoll, was selected for these trials due to their experienced pilot roster and frequent contact with American carrier-based fighters. Lieutenant Commander Yasuo Kozaki, the group's senior flight leader, was personally briefed on the intelligence findings and tasked with conducting systematic combat evaluations. Meanwhile, American intelligence was experiencing its own revelations about the changing dynamic of Pacific air combat. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, intelligence officer for Marine Aircraft Group 31, had begun noticing subtle changes in Japanese fighter tactics during recent engagements. Zero pilots, historically aggressive in vertical maneuvering, were increasingly avoiding climbing engagements with Corsair formations. Patterson's counterpart in the Navy, Commander Richard Blackwood aboard USS Essex, had observed similar behavioral changes among carrier-based Japanese pilots. Where Zero formations had previously used climbing attacks as their primary offensive tactic against American bomber formations, they were now employing hit-and-run attacks that avoided sustained vertical combat. The American intelligence apparatus initially interpreted these tactical changes as evidence of declining pilot quality among Japanese aviation units. The assumption was that inexperienced pilots were avoiding challenging maneuvering combat in favor of safer attack profiles. This interpretation would prove dangerously incomplete. Morrison's original encounter with Nakamura had been witnessed by several other pilots from VMF 124, including Technical Sergeant William Rodriguez, a veteran gunner aboard one of the escorting dive bombers. Rodriguez had watched the entire engagement through binoculars and later provided a detailed account to squadron intelligence officers. Rodriguez's testimony proved particularly valuable because he had observed numerous Zero engagements throughout his tour and could provide comparative analysis. He noted that Nakamura's Zero had performed normally during the initial phases of the combat, suggesting that mechanical problems hadn't contributed to the Japanese pilot's defeat. The Corsair's climbing performance had simply exceeded all previous American fighter capabilities Rodriguez had witnessed. Captain Hayes, Morrison's flight leader, filed his own intelligence report that focused on the tactical implications of the Corsair's vertical performance. Hayes recommended that Marine fighter squadrons begin emphasizing climbing attacks against Japanese formations, a significant departure from the diving attack profiles that had dominated American fighter tactics since 1942. The report reached Major General Ralph Mitchell, Commanding General of Marine Air Wings Pacific, within a week. Mitchell had been skeptical of the Corsair's combat potential when the aircraft first arrived in the Pacific, primarily due to its problematic carrier landing characteristics and initial mechanical problems. But accumulative combat reports from Marine squadrons were painting a picture of an aircraft that exceeded its original design specifications. Mitchell ordered comprehensive performance testing of the F4U 1A variant under combat conditions. Marine Air Group 14, operating from newly constructed airfields in the Marshall Islands, was tasked with conducting systematic climb rate measurements against captured Japanese aircraft. The results would provide definitive data about American fighter capabilities while revealing the true extent of the performance revolution occurring in Pacific skies. As March 1944 drew to a close, both sides found themselves grappling with rapidly evolving tactical realities.
The age of Japanese fighter superiority, built on the Zero's exceptional climbing ability and pilot training, was drawing to an end. American industrial capacity and engineering innovation were finally producing aircraft that could challenge Japanese fighters in their areas of traditional strength. But the full implications of this technological shift had yet to be realized by commanders on either side. The coming months would witness a fundamental transformation in Pacific air combat, driven by the Corsair's unexpected vertical performance and the tactical innovations it would inspire. Deep within the Chance Vote aircraft factory in Stratford, Connecticut, Chief Engineer Rex Beisel was unaware that his creation was revolutionizing combat thousands of miles away in the Pacific. The F4U Corsair had been designed primarily as a high-speed interceptor built around the most powerful engine available in 1940. What Beisel and his team hadn't fully anticipated was how their aircraft's unique combination of aerodynamic refinements and power plant technology would perform in vertical combat situations. The Corsair's distinctive inverted gull wing design, initially conceived to accommodate the massive propeller diameter required by the R2800 engine, had created unexpected aerodynamic benefits. Wind tunnel testing at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics facility in Langley, Virginia, had revealed that the wing's unique geometry reduced interference drag between the fuselage and wing root junction. This seemingly minor improvement translated into significantly better climb performance than conventional straight wing configurations. Meanwhile, at the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries facility in Nagoya, chief designer Jiro Horikoshi was receiving increasingly urgent requests from the Imperial Navy for improved Zero variants. The A6M model, introduced in late 1943, had been intended as a stopgap solution while more advanced designs reached production. But combat reports from the Pacific were indicating that even this improved version was being outclassed by the latest American fighters in ways that traditional performance upgrades couldn't address. Horikoshi faced fundamental limitations that his American counterparts didn't encounter. The Nakajima Sake 21 engine that powered the A6M represented the pinnacle of Japanese radial engine technology, but it produced only 1,130 horsepower compared to the Corsair's 2,000 horsepower R2800. More critically, Japanese metallurgy and fuel technology lagged behind American capabilities, limiting engine development options. The Zero's lightweight construction, once its greatest advantage, had become a liability in the changing combat environment. The aircraft's empty weight of just 4,136 pounds had enabled exceptional maneuverability and climb rate when facing heavier American fighters with less powerful engines, but against the Corsair's massive power-to-weight advantage, the Zero's structural limitations prevented it from carrying the additional equipment needed to remain competitive. Colonel Frank Schwable, commander of Marine Aircraft Group 12, had begun conducting his own informal performance evaluations based on pilot debriefings from recent combat missions. Schwable was a test pilot by training and understood aircraft performance characteristics better than most operational commanders. His analysis of Corsair combat reports revealed patterns that suggested the aircraft was performing beyond its published specifications.
Schwable's findings indicated that the F4U-1A's climb rate actually increased with altitude, peaking somewhere around 15,000 feet before gradually declining. This characteristic, combined with the aircraft's excellent high-altitude performance, created a tactical advantage that previous American fighters had never possessed. The Corsair could not only match Japanese fighters in initial climb rate, but could sustain superior climbing performance throughout the critical altitude band where most Pacific combat occurred. Lieutenant Commander David Richardson, a Navy test pilot stationed at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, was tasked with conducting comprehensive performance trials of the latest Corsair variants.
Richardson's testing protocol included climb rate measurements at various altitudes, weights, and power settings, providing definitive data about the aircraft's vertical performance capabilities. Richardson's initial test results seemed almost too good to be true. The F4U-1A achieved a climb rate of 3,870 feet per minute at sea level, declining to 3,120 feet per minute at 10,000 feet, then remarkably maintaining nearly that rate through 20,000 feet. By comparison, captured zero performance data indicated maximum climb rates of 3,100 feet per minute at sea level, dropping to 2,200 feet per minute at 15,000 feet. The test data revealed that the Corsair's two-stage, two-speed supercharger was the key to its superior high-altitude climbing performance. As atmospheric pressure decreased with altitude, the supercharger's second stage automatically engaged, maintaining manifold pressure and engine power output well beyond the altitude where single-stage superchargers began to lose effectiveness. Captain Thomas Lanphier, a veteran P-38 pilot who had recently transitioned to the Corsair, provided valuable comparative analysis based on his experience with multiple American fighter types. Lanphier noted that the Corsair's vertical performance surpassed even the twin-engine Lightning, which had previously been considered the best climbing American fighter in the Pacific theater. News of the Corsair's capabilities began filtering back to aircraft manufacturers and military procurement offices in the United States. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, manufacturer of the Navy's primary carrier-based fighter, the F-6F Hellcat, found itself under pressure to match the Corsair's performance specifications. The Hellcat, while successful in combat, couldn't match the Corsair's climb rate despite using the same basic engine. Roy Grumman personally reviewed the comparative performance data and concluded that the Corsair's aerodynamic refinements provided advantages that couldn't be easily retrofitted to the Hellcat design. The F-6F's conventional wing configuration and different fuselage proportions created drag characteristics that limited its vertical performance potential regardless of engine power. At Republic Aviation, designers working on the P-47 Thunderbolt faced similar challenges. The Thunderbolt's massive radial engine produced even more power than the Corsair's R2800, but the aircraft's weight and drag characteristics prevented it from achieving comparable climb rates. Alexander Carter-Valley, Republic's chief designer, initiated studies of the Corsair's wing design to understand the source of its aerodynamic advantages. The implications of the Corsair's performance extended beyond individual aircraft comparisons. American fighter doctrine, developed during the early years of the Pacific War, had emphasized diving attacks and high-speed passes to compensate for inferior climb rates compared to Japanese fighters. With the Corsair's arrival, American squadrons could for the first time engage Japanese fighters in sustained vertical combat with confidence. Major Gregory Pierce, operations officer for Marine Aircraft Group 21, began developing new tactical manuals that incorporated the Corsair's climbing capabilities into standard operating procedures. Pierce's tactics emphasized climbing attacks against Japanese formations, a complete reversal of previous American fighter doctrine that had avoided vertical engagements whenever possible. The psychological impact on American pilots was as significant as the tactical implications. For 2 years, Marine and Navy fighter pilots had operated under the assumption that Japanese fighters held inherent advantages in maneuverability and climb rate. The Corsair's performance finally provided American pilots with an aircraft that could challenge Japanese fighters in areas of traditional Japanese superiority. First Lieutenant Carl Peterson, a recent addition to VMF 215, experienced this psychological transformation firsthand during his first combat mission in a Corsair. Peterson had previously flown F-4F Wildcats, where survival depended on avoiding vertical combat with Zeros. In the Corsair, Peterson found he could initiate climbing attacks with confidence, fundamentally changing his approach to aerial combat. The technical revolution represented by the Corsair's climbing performance was ultimately rooted in American industrial capabilities that Japanese manufacturers couldn't match. The precision manufacturing required for the R-28's two-stage supercharger, the high-octane aviation fuel that enabled maximum power output, and the advanced metallurgy that allowed reliable operation at extreme power settings all reflected American technological advantages that were becoming decisive factors in Pacific air combat. As spring 1944 progressed, the full scope of the Corsair's impact on Pacific air warfare was beginning to emerge. What had started as isolated reports of superior climbing performance was evolving into a comprehensive transformation of fighter combat dynamics, with implications that would reshape the entire air war in the Pacific. By April 1944, Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 323, the Death Rattlers, had become the proving ground for revolutionary new air combat tactics built around the Corsair's vertical capabilities. Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel Edward Murphy had assembled a unique collection of pilots, veterans from earlier Pacific campaigns, flying alongside fresh aviators who had trained exclusively on the F4U. This combination provided an ideal laboratory for developing tactics that could exploit the Corsair's climbing advantages. Murphy himself was a fascinating study in adaptation. Having flown F-4F Wildcats during the Guadalcanal campaign, he possessed intimate knowledge of the tactical limitations that had constrained American fighter operations throughout 1942 and 1943. His transition to the Corsair represented more than just learning a new aircraft. It required completely reimagining how American fighters could engage Japanese formations.
The breakthrough came during a mission on April 8 when VMF 323 encountered a large formation of Japanese bombers escorted by 16 Zeros over the Caroline Islands. Instead of the traditional diving attack from altitude, Murphy ordered his 12 Corsairs to position themselves below the Japanese formation and execute climbing attacks directly into the escort fighters. First Lieutenant Anthony Romano, Murphy's wingman, later described the engagement as unlike anything he'd experienced in previous aircraft. Romano had been shot down twice while flying wildcards, both times after being trapped in climbing engagements with Zeros. In the Corsair, he found himself able to pursue climbing Japanese fighters with complete confidence, maintaining firing position throughout extended vertical maneuvering. The results were devastating for the Japanese formation. 7 Zeros were destroyed in the initial climbing attack, with 3 more following to follow-up passes. The bomber formation, stripped of effective escort protection, suffered 11 losses to the remaining Corsair elements. Most significantly, not a single American aircraft was lost, marking the first time a Corsair squadron had achieved such a lopsided victory ratio against a well-escorted Japanese formation. Word of VMF 323's success spread rapidly through marine aviation channels. Major General Mitchell immediately ordered tactical evaluation missions by other Corsair squadrons to validate the climbing attack methodology. VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron, was among the first units to adopt the new tactics under the leadership of Major Robert Winston. Winston, a former Navy test pilot, brought analytical rigor to tactical development that complemented Murphy's operational experience. Winston's approach involved systematic testing of different climbing attack profiles, varying altitude separations, airspeed management, and formation geometry to optimize the Corsair's vertical advantages. The tactical revolution wasn't limited to Marine squadrons. Navy Fighter Squadron VF-17, operating from forward bases in the Solomon Islands, began incorporating climbing attacks into their standard operating procedures. Commander Samuel Harrison, VF-17's commanding officer, had initially been skeptical of vertical combat tactics based on his experience with earlier Navy fighters.
Harrison's conversion came during a memorable engagement on April 15th, when his 16 Corsairs intercepted a Japanese strike force targeting American shipping near Bougainville. The Japanese formation included 24 bombers escorted by 18 Zeros, representing exactly the type of heavily defended target that had previously required multiple American squadrons to engage successfully. VF-17 executed a coordinated climbing attack that caught the Japanese escort completely off guard. The Zeros, positioned above the bomber formation in their traditional defensive arrangement, found themselves unable to dive away from the climbing Corsairs without abandoning their charges. Attempts to outclimb the American fighters proved futile, leaving the Japanese pilots with no effective defensive options. Lieutenant James Mitchell, one of VF-17's most experienced pilots, shot down 3 Zeros during the engagement using pure vertical maneuvering. Mitchell had previously struggled against Japanese fighters in horizontal turning combat, where the Zero's lighter wing loading provided advantages. The Corsair's climbing capability finally gave him a combat regime where American technology held decisive superiority. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was becoming apparent through intelligence reports from multiple sources. Captured Japanese airmen consistently described feelings of helplessness when engaged by climbing Corsair formations. Petty Officer 2nd Class Kenji Watanabe, shot down during the April 15th engagement, told his interrogators that seeing American fighters climbing above his Zero felt like watching the natural order of aircraft collapse. Japanese squadron commanders began filing urgent requests for tactical guidance to counter the American climbing attacks. Wing Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter leaders, conducted personal combat trials against American formations to develop effective countermeasures. Sakai's analysis proved deeply troubling for Japanese tactical doctrine. He determined that the Corsair's climbing performance made traditional Japanese defensive formations vulnerable to systematic destruction. The standard Japanese practice of positioning escort fighters above bomber formations actually facilitated American climbing attacks by concentrating targets in predictable positions. More critically, Sakai concluded that Japanese fighters could no longer rely on vertical maneuvering to escape unfavorable combat situations. The climbing turn, which had been the Zero's most reliable defensive maneuver since 1941, had become a death trap when employed against Corsair formations. New Japanese tactical instructions, distributed in late April, reflected the desperation of air commanders facing an increasingly hopeless situation. Pilots were ordered to avoid vertical combat entirely, instead relying on hit-and-run attacks that minimized exposure time. These defensive tactics represented a complete abandonment of the aggressive fighter doctrine that had dominated Japanese air operations throughout the early war period. The transformation wasn't without challenges for American pilots either. Captain Robert Hayes, now serving as VMF-124's operations officer, identified several problems with the new climbing attack tactics. Inexperienced pilots sometimes became fixated on individual Japanese fighters during climbing engagements, losing situational awareness and becoming vulnerable to attack from other members of the Japanese formation. Hayes developed training protocols that emphasized formation integrity during climbing attacks. His methods required pilots to maintain visual contact with their wingmen throughout vertical maneuvering, ensuring that individual pursuits didn't compromise squadron defensive capabilities. The technological advantages that enabled the Corsair's climbing superiority were becoming apparent to Japanese intelligence analysts as well. Captured American aircraft components revealed the sophistication of the R2800 engine supercharger system and the precision manufacturing tolerances that enabled reliable high-altitude operation. Commander Watanabe's intelligence staff concluded that Japanese industry lacked the capability to produce comparable power plants within any realistic time frame. The metallurgical requirements for advanced supercharger components exceeded Japanese manufacturing capabilities, while fuel limitations prevented existing Japanese engines from operating at power settings that might have closed the performance gap. By late April 1944, the tactical revolution initiated by the Corsair's climbing capabilities had fundamentally altered the dynamics of Pacific air combat. American fighter squadrons that had spent 2 years avoiding vertical engagements with Japanese fighters were now seeking such encounters with complete confidence. Japanese pilots, previously aggressive in vertical maneuvering, found themselves forced into purely defensive roles that negated their training and experience advantages.
The implications extended beyond individual engagements to strategic air warfare. Japanese bomber formations, no longer adequately protected by their fighter escorts, began suffering unsustainable losses during daylight operations. This development would force Japanese air commanders to reconsider their entire approach to offensive air operations, ultimately contributing to Japan's loss of air superiority throughout the Pacific theater. The summer of 1944 marked the complete transformation of Pacific air warfare, with the Corsair's climbing superiority serving as the catalyst for changes that would echo through aviation history. What began as Lieutenant Jake Morrison's individual encounter with a Japanese Zero had evolved into a systematic revolution that redefined air combat doctrine, aircraft design philosophy, and the strategic balance of power in the Pacific theater. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of Pacific Fleet Operations, received his first comprehensive briefing on the Corsair's impact during a staff meeting at Pearl Harbor on June 12, 1944. The statistical evidence was overwhelming. American fighter squadrons equipped with Corsairs were achieving kill ratios of nearly 8-to-1 against Japanese fighters, compared to previous ratios that rarely exceeded 3-to-1 even with experienced pilots and favorable tactical conditions. Captain Joseph Clark, Nimitz's aviation staff officer, presented data showing that Japanese bomber formations were suffering catastrophic losses whenever they encountered Corsair squadrons employing climbing attack tactics. The traditional Japanese practice of using high-altitude fighter escorts had become counterproductive, as these escorts could no longer protect their charges from American fighters that could climb above them at will. The implications for American offensive operations were profound. Strike missions that had previously required massive fighter escorts to penetrate Japanese air defenses could now be executed with smaller formations, freeing up aircraft and pilots for additional operations. The efficiency gains allowed American air commanders to increase sortie rates while reducing pilot fatigue and aircraft attrition. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's aviation staff was grappling with the collapse of their fighter defense strategy. Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, convened an emergency conference of squadron commanders to address the crisis. The assembled pilots painted a uniformly grim picture of encounters with American Corsair formations. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Nakamura, now recovered from his bailout over the Marshall Islands, provided first-hand testimony about the Corsair's capabilities. Nakamura's account carried special weight because of his reputation for accurate combat reporting and his extensive experience against American fighters. His description of the Corsair's climbing performance contradicted fundamental assumptions about American aircraft design that had guided Japanese tactics since Pearl Harbor. Commander Minoru Genda, now serving as Kakuta's chief of staff, presented a comprehensive analysis of American fighter evolution that traced the development from the early F4F Wildcat through to the current F4U Corsair. Genda's assessment concluded that American industrial capacity had finally produced an aircraft that negated Japanese technological advantages while exploiting American strengths in engine technology and manufacturing precision.
The Japanese response involved desperate attempts to develop countermeasures using existing aircraft and tactics. Test pilot Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai was assigned to evaluate captured American aircraft components and develop new combat techniques that might restore some measure of tactical parity. Sakai's evaluation of recovered Corsair engine components revealed the sophistication of American supercharger technology. The two-stage, two-speed design maintained power output at altitudes where Japanese single-stage superchargers lost effectiveness. More critically, the precision manufacturing tolerances exceeded Japanese industrial capabilities by significant margins. Engine manufacturer Nakajima Aircraft Company received urgent orders to develop improved power plants that could match American performance. Chief Engineer Yasuo Tanaka's team worked frantically to design supercharger systems comparable to the American R2800, but faced insurmountable obstacles in metallurgy and fuel technology. Japanese fuel limitations proved particularly constraining. The high-octane aviation gasoline required for maximum engine performance was unavailable due to refining capacity limitations and raw material shortages. Even if Japanese engineers could design engines comparable to American power plants, they lacked the fuel to operate them at competitive power settings. The strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly as American forces prepared for major offensive operations against Japanese island strongholds. The Corsair's air superiority capabilities were enabling American amphibious assaults that would have been impossible without complete control of local airspace. Major General Curtis LeMay, commanding the XI-1 Bomber Command, incorporated Corsair escort capabilities into his strategic bombing plans against Japanese industrial targets. LeMay's analysis showed that Corsair escorts could protect bomber formations at altitudes and ranges that previous American fighters couldn't maintain effectively. The first major test of Corsair capabilities in strategic bombing operations came during the June 24th raid against aircraft manufacturing facilities in the Marianas. 36 Corsairs from Marine Aircraft Groups 21 and 31 provided escort for 60 B-24 Liberator bombers attacking Japanese production centers. The defending Japanese fighter force included 42 aircraft from 3 different air groups, representing one of the largest concentrations of Japanese fighters assembled since the previous year. The battle that followed would become a textbook example of how technological superiority could overcome numerical disadvantages in aviation warfare. Major Edward Thompson, leading the Corsair escort, employed climbing attack tactics against the Japanese interceptors with devastating effectiveness. The Japanese fighters, attempting to reach the bomber formation at 22,000 feet, found themselves systematically destroyed by Corsairs climbing from below. Thompson's formation destroyed 18 Japanese fighters while losing only 2 aircraft to ground-based anti-aircraft fire. Captain James Rodriguez, Thompson's deputy commander, noted that the Japanese pilots seemed psychologically defeated before the engagement began. Their formation flying lacked the precision and aggression that had characterized Japanese fighter operations during the early war period. The knowledge that their aircraft couldn't compete with American fighters in vertical combat had undermined their confidence and tactical effectiveness.
The psychological dimension of the Corsair's impact extended beyond individual pilot morale to affect Japanese strategic planning. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, was forced to acknowledge that Japanese air power could no longer contest American offensive operations effectively. This recognition would lead to fundamental changes in Japanese defensive strategy that emphasized kamikaze attacks over conventional fighter operations.
The technological lessons learned from Corsair development were already influencing the next generation of American fighter aircraft. Republic Aviation's upcoming P-47N Thunderbolt incorporated design elements inspired by the Corsair's success, while Grumman's F-8F Bearcat project emphasized climbing performance as a primary design requirement. Alexander Kartveli, Republic's chief designer, personally studied the Corsair's wing configuration to understand the aerodynamic principles that enabled its superior climbing capability. Kartveli's analysis led to modifications in the P-47N's wing design that improved climb rate while maintaining the aircraft's other performance characteristics. At Grumman, Roy Grumman himself supervised the Bearcat's development to ensure that it could match or exceed the Corsair's vertical performance. The Bearcat project represented Grumman's acknowledgement that future fighter aircraft would be judged primarily on their ability to climb and maneuver at altitude, rather than on horizontal speed or firepower alone. The influence of Corsair design philosophy extended to post-war aircraft development as well. The climbing performance advantages demonstrated in Pacific combat would guide fighter design for decades, emphasizing power plant technology and aerodynamic efficiency over pure speed or armament capacity. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, whose original encounter with Nakamura had initiated this transformation, completed his combat tour in August 1944 with 11 confirmed victories. Morrison's success exemplified the broader revolution in American fighter pilot capabilities enabled by the Corsair's performance advantages. Pilots who might have struggled in earlier aircraft found themselves achieving exceptional combat records when flying aircraft that could exploit American technological superiority. Morrison's post-war interview with military historians provided insight into the psychological transformation that accompanied the technological revolution. He described the confidence that came from flying an aircraft that could challenge Japanese fighters in any combat regime, eliminating the tactical constraints that had limited American fighter operations throughout the early war period. The statistical evidence of the Corsair's impact was overwhelming by war's end. Marine and Navy squadrons equipped with Corsairs achieved collective kill ratios exceeding 10-to-1 against Japanese fighters during the final year of combat. These results reflected not just superior aircraft performance, but the tactical innovations that the Corsair's capabilities had made possible. More significantly, the Corsair's climbing superiority had enabled American forces to achieve air supremacy over Japanese-controlled territories, facilitating the amphibious operations that would ultimately end the Pacific War. The aircraft's impact extended far beyond individual air-to-air engagements to influence the entire strategic balance of the conflict. The Japanese aviation industry never recovered from the technological gap that the Corsair's success had revealed. Attempts to develop competitive aircraft continued through 1945, but were hampered by material shortages, manufacturing limitations, and the fundamental constraints of Japanese industrial capacity. The Kawanishi N1KJ Shidenkai, Japan's most advanced fighter, achieved performance levels comparable to earlier American fighters but could never match the Corsair's climbing capability. By September 1945, when Japan surrendered, the Corsair had become the dominant fighter aircraft in the Pacific theater. Its climbing performance had revolutionized air combat tactics, influenced aircraft design philosophy worldwide, and demonstrated the decisive importance of technological superiority in modern warfare. The legacy of that first encounter between Morrison's Corsair and Nakamura's Zero extended far beyond the immediate tactical advantages it revealed. The engagement had exposed fundamental limitations in Japanese aircraft design, while highlighting American technological capabilities that would shape aviation development for decades to come.
In the broader context of World War II, the Corsair's climbing superiority represented a turning point where American industrial capacity and engineering innovation finally overcame the tactical advantages that had given Japanese forces air superiority during the early war period. The aircraft's success validated the American approach to fighter design that emphasized raw performance over maneuverability, establishing principles that would guide military aviation into the jet age. The transformation initiated by the Corsair's vertical performance capabilities ultimately changed how air forces worldwide approached fighter design, pilot training, and tactical doctrine. What began as one pilot's surprising discovery over the Marshall Islands had evolved into a revolution that redefined aerial warfare and established American air power supremacy that would endure long after the guns fell silent in the Pacific.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.